Today I want to talk about the recruiting calendar and what recruiting is going to look like in 2020 now that we got some very important news, and all that's coming up after the bumper.
Don't be cornering me. Hold up. Time. You gotta help me with that corner shit.
What's up, kinfolk? It's RJ Young. I am not on a step mill. Consider hitting the like and subscribe button because I upload a video every single day. It's always college football related, sports related. We have a good time. Today I want to talk about how the recruiting calendar is going to look in 2020, which is a very interesting question to answer now that news was delivered late on Wednesday afternoon that the NCAA has extended the recruiting dead period to July 31st when we thought it was previously going to end on June 30th. This is interesting news for two reasons. One, we thought that we would get something like getting back to football around July 1 with many students returning to campus on June 15th, and I should say student athletes returning to campus June 15th. I've even heard rumor that some kids are going to return to places around the country like Oklahoma State on June 1, right? So as early as June 1 when we get guys returning back to their respective campuses to begin their voluntary workouts. We also had news 2 weeks ago actually, about May 13th, May 18th, May 13th is when we got the news that June 30th was going to be the deadline or the extension of the recruiting dead period. And then May 18th was when we found out that Division II universities were going to be hosting something like camps or recruiting visits. And keeping up with some of the kids locally who were invited out there, I got word from a couple that they were headed to Washburn in June, and I was like, that sounds weird. And then this basically is contradictory news, right? Because Washburn was under the impression that they would be allowed to do this because they're D2 school along with other D2 schools. And I don't think that that's still on the table now that the dead period has been extended to July 31. And since the dead period has been extended to July 31, and since kids have not been able to make visits since about March 13th, I'm very interested to know if we should have an early signing period from you, one, but I don't think that we should. I mean, I'm a proponent of the early signing period in a normal year, but seeing as we're going to come up on at least 4 months, over 100 days of no visits and no officials or unofficials or traveling by coaches, I don't see how you could actually ask the kids to make a very good decision or coaches to make good evaluations in a very short amount of time where they're supposed to be playing college football. Like the summer is supposed to be about recruiting. It's supposed to be about evaluation. It's supposed to be about getting better, getting bigger, getting stronger, and showing off what you can at some non-contact camps. Some of those are rivals. Some of those are 247. Some of those are team camps. And everybody would have loved to have held theirs beginning basically in March, right? Where you would have had not just your camps for top 247 talent and rivals talent, but also you would have had your junior days and you would have your spring games and you would have officials and unofficials for high value targets and kids. And this is important because the kids make their decisions in large part based on how they feel once they get to campus and how their parents feel about that campus, in addition to how the coaches treat them and what the roster looks like. I've seen more kids over this period make decisions based on what the roster will look like and having visited that place before, rather than wait for if, when, how they get to make a visit. Because while I like talking about commitments because it helps with the news cycle and it gives us things to discuss, like Tennessee getting 24 commitments before June 1, I'm partial to wanting the kids to take more time to figure out what they're going to do. And the problem with that right now is you don't really have much to go on except a virtual visit, which is a Zoom meeting, right? As much as that's cool and being able to pick the brains of some coaches, they're also trying to sell you on what they got. And you don't really get to take in the whole experience where you get to talk with more than just them, talk with players in their environments, get to visit the dorms. All of these things are important specifically for how you feel about the place, but also for the schools that want to be able to show off these things that they spent a ton of money on for these kinds of ventures, like for trying to bring kids in to secure their commitments. If you can take visits, right, and it's still if in the fall, as we all believe right now we're going to get football on time, what would stop the NCAA from limiting the number of visits and the number of visitors that you can host? If you're a school where you might normally have 5 officials that you could take, what if that's just 1? And think about the jockeying that would take place from these schools to try to get that one kid on campus, and how they're really going to be at their wits' end trying to figure out which kid they absolutely need to get on campus and which kid they can try to press into a commitment or signing in early signing period, because right now that's still on the schedule. That's a thing that's still happening. It's also really interesting from the standpoint of a place like Alabama, right? Where Nick Saban does a lot of his recruiting. I mean, he recruits all throughout the year, but he does a lot of his closing on the commitments around the season, right? And heading into the early signing period, he is notorious for picking off top talent from other programs. Jase McClellan is an example of this for Oklahoma. He was committed for like 2 years, and then on early signing period eve, Nick Saban comes through and he commits and signs with Alabama. That might not be the case this year because you haven't had opportunities to build up those sorts of relationships, and you might not be allowed to travel in the way that we're just used to being able to travel. I'm really interested to see how this thing goes over at the professional level, because while I'm not terribly sympathetic to Major League Baseball owners or players for that matter, it's striking to me that they cannot get a deal done when it seems like the NFL is going to find a way to make players something like whole, not totally whole, if they expect to play on time and get this PPE and safety standards in place. It feels like the NBA is going to get their season back underway. What the playoffs might look like in late July is interesting to talk about. And NHL has already said we're going to get this done and we expect to play hockey in the late summer. I want to know what that's going to mean for travel. I want to know what that's going to mean for fans, because while you can say you're playing in 2 different locations, right? Are you going to be able to travel a bunch of fans? Probably not, right? So if you can't travel a bunch of fans, is Nick Saban going to be jumping on a private plane to just kind of make private plane trips? It's on the table, right? It can happen. They got enough money and they got the planes. But if everybody can't do that, why should Nick Saban be able to do that? Well, because he can, right? Capitalism, whatnot. But if there are rules that prevent him from doing that, that's where we're going to get this thing to be really interesting. The other thing I'd say about this is that February signing period is going to matter. No matter how we strike this out, right? Like whether it's the early signing period is still in play or we just kick it off and just go straight to February, it's going to matter because everybody's going to want to try to get their visits in after the season ends, because we would expect by that time we'd be, basically on the verge of a vaccine, and people would be chomping at the bit to travel and be chomping at the bit to try to get to campus, and coaches would do everything in their power to try to get those kids to campus. All of these things are very important. All of these things are very interesting, and all these questions deserve more questions rather than answers. Just continue to ask questions until we get answers that seem concrete and that we're all kind of sort of on board with, because this is a moving target that changes every day. And as we get closer to football, we'll see this stuff start to solidify, even as much as like who's going to host how many fans at their events, right? Because Iowa State coming out and saying we're only going to have half does not mean that perhaps Oklahoma State is going to host half of what Boone Pickens might. They might just decide that they're going to try to fill the stadium. It's all very, very weird, but that's the news. That's how I see it. We'll talk about it later. All right, that's it for me. Deuces.